Hello, everyone. My name is Vishnu, and with me today is Muis,
Hi, everyone.
and welcome to the UDOS podcast. This is the podcast where we'll be talking about topics you might not know enough about. So, today we're going to talk about the country right next to Mother Russia. We're going to talk about North Korea. So, a lot of us know about North Korea as a country led by Kim Jong un, who is a dictator, who has an iron fist on his community, and how his country is in a terrible state. So, what we're going to discuss today is we're going to talk about how are we going to take down North Korea in the first place. But before we get to that, we need to answer a very important question. Which country is most capable of taking down North Korea, and why would they want to do it in the first place? So, Muis, what do you have for me?
Right. So, regarding North Korea and its relation with other countries, we can rule out a few countries that, although they have the capability, but they don't necessarily have the reason. And
Mhm.
we'll get down to the most legitimate actor that can actually do it. So, let's go on to the first one of who has the capability of acting against North Korea. So, the general idea is any country that is somewhat economically and politically developed can
Okay.
have attacked North Korea, for example, the Western world,
Mm.
European countries, US primarily. China can do it also because they are economically developed as well as politically. Russia definitely can. Russia and China has an advantage in which they are closer to North Korea,
Mm.
geographically. South Korea has a very big reason to do it because they're also very close to to North Korea. But ultimately, it all comes down to who is the most capable and who is the most willing to take action. It all comes down to the US because US views themselves as the global leader in fighting for democracy and for human rights, and both of those are traits that North Korea doesn't have
Mhm.
and actively goes against. And the US being the most economically developed, the most militarized, most has the largest number of nuclear missiles, those are good reasons for why the US would do it. Another reason is the fact that the US is also the ones leading all of the other countries. For example, South Korea
Mhm.
is allied to the US, and South Korea would usually wait for the US if any action was to be taken lah.
All
So
right.
answering those two questions, it would be the US.
Okay. All right. So, we also need to understand that China and Russia have some history with North Korea. We'll get into that later when we talk about the other steps that can be taken on. But what going forward, we just want to make it clear that the most likely actor to take down North Korea is going to be US. So most of our steps on how to take down North Korea is going to be based on the US lens. So the first thing we're going to talk about is assassination. So understand that Kim Jong un is the supreme leader of North Korea. So we are going to be assassinating Kim Jong un. So let's first understand why do we want to take down Kim Jong un, right? So here's why assassination is so good. Firstly, is you don't need to carry out a formal war to fight against a country. That means there are less lives lost, there's less collateral damage, there's less destruction on a larger scale, right? It's a very clean job because you just need to take down one individual as opposed to fighting an entire country. But there are a couple of issues that come with having an assassination in the first place. So let's just say we are the US government, right? And there is a bill proposed in order to assassinate Kim Jong un. This bill will struggle to pass through the Senate because of political interests of the parties, because some of them feel that taking down Kim Jong un is extremely dangerous because there may be a power vacuum. So there's a lot of difficulty in passing the Senate, but that's not what we're here for. We're here for in the event it is possible, right? So let's just say that this bill does pass through the Senate. It is still very, very unlikely. Now, it is for a different reason, and it's because of how North Korea works. So, North Korea is a very, very close state. Close state meaning that a lot of information is unknown about the country. That means we don't have enough intel about how the country operates, how its security works, how military works, right? Like more often than not, most of the information you hear from the news is either North Korea probably publishes on its North Korean state propaganda, or sometimes you have spies or some undercover intel that we're able to obtain. But the point is, it's very hard to get information about North Korea. That's number one. The second thing is it is very hard to isolate Kim Jong Un himself. And let me just give you an idea about how this works, right? So, how Kim Jong Un works or how he travels, right, is he always travels at dawn. He travels at hours where people are less likely to find him alone. That's number one. Number two is he always changes the locations that he's traveling to or he will meet with people just to avoid being assassinated. And three is that no one knows where he is at any specific point in time. Like even his family members do not know. Maybe his secret service or like his own form of CIA would probably know where he is, but even then, the information is with a very few group or very small group of people. So the best chance to ever like kill Kim Jong Un, right, is if we were to influence one of his closest people, one of his closest confidants, and even then, it is very, very, very unlikely. And the main reason is this: that Kim Jong Un is very aware about the threats to himself. How does he prevent people from attacking him, right? So what he does is he will randomly execute certain family members, sometimes with intent, sometimes without intent, just to stoke more fear within his own group of people so that they do not overthrow him. So to put it in short, assassinating Kim Jong Un will be very difficult, not just to pass through the US Senate or the US government, but also to implement it in the real life just because of how secluded North Korea can be and just how vigilant Kim Jong Un is about his personal space. So, Muis, what else could we do to take down North Korea?
Right. So we've already analyzed how assassination, although seems like a very good option, doesn't lead to the greatest outcomes afterwards, the aftermath of the assassination. For example, the spillover of now you need to silence every other individual that wants to retaliate against your actions, right? So I think like taking a step away from assassination, that is like targeting the individual that drives the regime, maybe we can try and control the regime. So we can put a puppet leader in place of Kim Jong Un and have that puppet leader pander towards certain countries and become allies, and then the allies states can better regulate North Korea and push North Korea to a greater outcome. For example, maybe democracy, maybe upholding better human rights, maybe stop nuclear militarization. Right. So the idea is putting a puppet leader in place of Kim Jong Un. So rather than taking out the individual, you try to take out the regime. So analyzing this idea of putting a puppet leader, right, I think the first question would be who has the greatest advantage in putting a puppet leader there? Because ultimately, as much as the US has the most capability, has the most reason to put a puppet leader there, US doesn't have the greatest advantage when we talk about putting down a puppet leader because geographically they're very far. Intel is very hard to reach them. So the greatest possibility for the US is allying with South Korea and having South Korea put up a puppet leader. But the problem with South Korea is the fact that it is already seen very like clearly that South Korea has a large reason to put a puppet leader to infiltrate into the regime. So Kim Jong-un has most likely already taken steps to ensure that this doesn't happen. So the way that Kim Jong-un does it is by like spreading propaganda that he does best. So how South Korea would likely try and do this is by having South Korean sympathizers within North Korea try to take over Kim Jong-un.
Okay.
Now, the problem with that is the propaganda that I talked about before heavily favors North Korea. What does that propaganda look like? It's just basically saying North Korea is better than South Korea. We have grass, we have a lot of land, we have a lot of food, for example. Like, as ridiculous as that sounds, North Korea being the very close nation that it is, the people are forced kind of to believe that. So South Korean sympathizers is very low, and it's very hard for South Korea or the Western world in that instance to put up a puppet leader, right?
Yeah.
So another possible actor that can put up a puppet leader would be China, primarily because China is very close. They are bordering North Korea. And within North Korea themselves, there are already people that look at China in a very favorable light because China plays a very large role in providing basic resources to North
North
Korea
Korea.
because of diplomatic reasons, right?
Yeah.
Because as much as sanctions the Western world puts on North Korea, China is very good bypass to that sanction.
Correct.
So China has the ability to also influence and put up a puppet leader. But again, Kim Jong Un being the very scared person that he is, very like paranoid, he
Hmm.
does public executions of people that he believes
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
against his interests to instill fear among the people. Like
Mm.
the extent is the fact that he even went so far as to publicly execute his uncle because Kim Jong Un believes that his uncle could be a confidant of the West of China, and Kim Jong Un doesn't like that. So maybe like another actor that is most favorable, assuming that all countries are at the same level, the targeted individual that can best fight the propaganda and move past all of this fear mongering that the Kim regime does is by having an individual from the Kim family themselves. So
Mm.
I first want to like show you what the Kim family, like the vision of a Kim family within North Korea. So
Okay.
propaganda works very hard. The Kim family, Kim Jong Un, Kim Jong Nam, and every other Kims that exist within
Yeah.
the power, like the vision that the people have is the fact that the Kim family is very much like gods. They are born supernatural. They have supernatural powers. They can control the weather. They don't need to go to the toilet. They don't need to
Yeah.
eat. They eat purely for fun, for leisure. And these people are on a different level. You know, they walk and then plants grow behind them. Like these are the bringers of life. So the best individual within the Kim family is actually Kim Jong Nam. The
Mm.
reason being the fact that most of the people within the Kim family already have certain benefits that Kim Jong Un gives them to take away the incentive to take over the regime. But the best individual is Kim Jong Nam because Kim Jong Nam, previous to Kim Jong Un, was the heir to the regime, but
Mm.
he was exiled for for reasons that I'm not entirely aware of, and I'm not sure if many people are aware of. But going past that, like going back to the idea that Kim Jong Un is very paranoid, he has already assassinated Kim Jong Nam. And I'm sure many of you remember this, especially for those
Yeah.
Malaysians, because this happened on Malaysian soil in Malaysia. So in the end, being a puppet leader, like replacing Kim Jong Un with a puppet leader, is a very difficult feat. But it is an alternative nonetheless, and we can see how it might work. But we do need to push past the fear mongering that might happen.
Mm.
Yeah. So maybe another alternative, Vishnu.
Like I've seen, if I'm not mistaken, Kim Jong Un has a sister as well. And like in
That's true.
2020, when like there was all these memes that Kim Jong Un had died, or there was rumors where he died, and then there were a lot of articles popping up about his sister possibly taking over and how she's like even more of a tyrant than him. So the
Mm.
options are quite limited when it comes to a puppet
Yes.
leader. So yeah, thank God not for her. So yeah, now we have analyzed whether an assassination could work and whether installing a puppet leader could work. And we know how paranoid Kim Jong Un can be. So we're going to talk about how the people are going to take down North Korea. So we're going to call this the Korean Spring, inspired by the Arab Spring. So what does the Korean Spring basically mean? It basically means the uprising of the people to challenge the government, right? So how do we inspire the people to challenge the government? I think if the people know more or they are given support, that is when the people will challenge the government more often, right? But again, the biggest problem we have is that North Korea is a very closed state. That means to get info to the North Korean people is very, very difficult. But there have been ways where the people from South and North Korea have infiltrated the North Korean limit of sending in information. So if you have not heard, there are stories where South Korean people like throw CDs across like the border or put it in the ocean and then like just send it over to North Korea, and then people will like open DVDs, will play it, or they'll read pamphlets of like K-pop and stuff. So this is how people from South Korea send over information to North Korea. Remember that a lot of North Koreans and South Koreans are family members, they are relatives. So they have an incentive to unite, right? So that is why they have some trust with their brothers from the other side. So this is where this information is trusted by them, and this is where they get more information. So when they know more about how open the world is, how democratized the state of South Korea is, and how free it is and how the US isn't as bad as the North, paint that picture. This gives the people the confidence in order to overthrow the North Korean regime. So, what are the impacts if we suddenly have more people being aware about the North Korean state? I think it gives greater confidence to firstly leave the state. That means you have a lot more defectors. Already, it's very rare for us to see North Korean defectors coming from North Korea to South Korea, but defectors do exist. And if you listen to a lot of interviews, more often than not, they are the main reason they came is because they hated life under North Korean regime. So these were people who were like capable because they were the military, they lived near the border, so they could just like run for like the few miles of their life, and then they come to South Korea. Second thing is when that realization strikes that your country sucks, that your leader is pretty useless, then when you have the fall from grace, like for example, North Korea at one point could fight Japan, and now all North Korea is trying to do is like restrict your haircuts, right? Like that is how controlled and that's how small the North Korean state has become. When that understanding exists, that is when the people will challenge their leader. So what does challenging their leader look like? I think a lot of Western states have done this in many other Middle Eastern states, for example, where they fund rebellions, where they fund certain groups that are going to overthrow the regime. I think this is perfectly possible in North Korea as well. So here's the thing. We've already talked about this before, where Kim Jong-un always kills some of the people he doesn't trust, right? But it's very important that he rides a very fine line, because if he kills too many people, he is seen as extremely weak. But if he kills too few people, then he seems like a target that can be overthrown because he can't lose that support. So Kim Jong-un right now is riding a very fine line when it comes to the right balance of political and social support within his country. With that being said, we need to understand why else would the people want to overthrow, right? So rather than just sending K-pop or like pop culture across the border as information, I think the most important information these people need is confidence that they can overthrow the North Korean regime. And you don't need to look further than the Arab Springs, than the Berlin Wall. Why are these two examples so significant? The Berlin Wall is so significant because even when the Western world and Russia had their conflict of interest to create proxy states, to separate countries based on their ideology, the people of Germany pushed for their own beliefs to unite under one country, and both Russia and the Western world had to forego their interest to just allow the people to unite because their desire was so strong. Like they just fought through the barriers and they just went and met their relatives and they started hugging, whatever they do, right? The Arab Springs. This is extremely significant because if you do not know, a decade ago or even nowadays, a lot of Arabian countries had dictator-like leaders. Corruption was rife. And Arab Spring is basically where the people revolted in Tunisia, then it spread to Egypt. Saudi Arabia even felt threatened themselves. That was how influential this revolution was. So these examples are important because it shows that if the will of the people is strong enough, you could even challenge geopolitical interests that Russia could have, or US could have, or any other countries could have within this region. So there'll always be obstacles in order to create this revolution, right? Like initially, North Korea will be very, very scared and paranoid, which means that their assassinations will increase. People will go missing more often. They will increase state propaganda. There will be more isolationist than ever. But again, if you look back at history, people knew how bad Stalin was. People knew how bad Chairman Mao was. People knew how bad Pol Pot of Cambodia was. History tells you that people will know about this information. So North Korea needs to confront this reality as soon as possible, because if they don't, the people will. So that is how the Korean Spring would look like. And there's one more thing we're going to talk about after we talk about the Korean Spring. And this is a bit interesting. It's about this Eastern alliance that could overthrow Kim Jong-un. So Moise, talk to me. What does this Eastern alliance look like?
So the Eastern Alliance. Before I move on, I would like to actually add a few bits to what we heard regarding the People's Uprising. So the People's Uprising ultimately falls down to the hands of the people, and if the people are capable of actually overthrowing the regime, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that is, as much as we can give the citizen guns in the worst of instances, right, to allow
Yeah.
for probability of success to happen. Like at the end of the day, the distribution of food ultimately is in the hands of the dictators. So the
True.
people are not as well like capable enough. They don't have they're malnourished, they
Mm,
have very low morale, propaganda is all over
that's
and
true.
it's in their bloods now. So the best way in which we can approach this, I guess, like in a non-violent way, like
Mm,
as much as all of the other three alternatives we gave was like inclusive of some element of violence,
true.
going all the way down to diplomacy, what is the options that we have? So that's where the question that Vishnu gave me was very important. Lah. So Eastern Alliance is basically how the Western world will approach North Korea's current alliance. And the largest of the alliances is China, because
Mm,
they're geographically close and how they have some form of political alignment in terms of how their governments work.
mm-hmm.
So, Eastern Alliance would be how the Western world, European countries as well as US and Canada, will convince North Korea, not North Korea, sorry, will convince
China.
China will convince China to stop their alliance with North Korea.
Okay.
Because I want to highlight what happens right now in status quo is the fact that the reason why, even with all of the sanctions that is put upon by the Western world upon North Korea, China is a very good ally to North Korea, in which China is the one that bypasses all of these sanctions because
Mm,
China is economically developed and doesn't necessarily depend on the West as much as other countries. So China does help fund North Korean systems and North Korean regimes.
mm,
But the reason why China does that is because China fears being surrounded, in a word, surrounded by Western powers, and that could threaten the Chinese, uh, China itself.
yeah.
For example, right now China has the border with like North Korea acts as a buffer state between South Korea and China.
Mm,
So if North Korea were to fall to the hands of the Western world, then South Korea will approach and take over the land of North Korea, and that puts the North Korean border with South Korea all the way up to China and South Korea,
mm.
and North like China sees that as a threat.
All right.
But the problem with that is it ultimately depends on whether North Korea can sustain itself being the buffer state within those two countries. And how the Western world would approach like making China an ally is usually by like most likely would say North Korea is ultimately a dictatorship regime that will eventually fall because even in
True.
status quo, they depend purely on China uh to live, to even
Yeah.
like do any form of militarized action. So if the Western world was able to convince China on like why is it that the interest of China is much better to ally themselves with the Western world,
Mm,
because the buffer state won't exist forever, and if the buffer state does like disappear, then all of the North Korean people that are now displaced will inevitably move to China
China.
as refugees, and that will like make even more social problems to exist within China, of how they'll have microaggression with North Korean people within China, and
Mm-hmm.
how Chinese people already don't view North Koreans as all that favorable, maybe because that is because of the nuclear weapons that North Korea has. So ultimately, China does have some incentive to listen to the Western world in that instance.
Mm,
So now let's assume that China does go with the Western world and diplomacy does happen, and China uh, does comply with the sanctions that the Western world has placed upon North Korea. How would that affect North Korea? At the end of the day, as much as we would like for a greater change to happen, changes are actually very minimal. Because talking
okay.
about sanctions ultimately hurt the people on the ground the most. In other words, North Korea being very focused on militarizing their nuclear weapons because the Kim family sees that as a very essential part of ensuring the regime continues, taking lessons from history, for example, like
Mm,
Muammar Gaddafi or maybe Saddam Hussein. Both of those were dictatorship regimes that had the ability to develop their nuclear arsenal, but ultimately they let go, and the end game for that regime was they ultimately fell down to the Western powers. And I don't think North Korea would want to
Want to
follow
do
that
that.
anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So ultimately, even if you do sanction, they'll just take the money that is used to feed the people to ultimately still fund nuclear warhead programs. And if North Korea is pushed back into a corner, then the possibility of North Korea retaliating with nuclear against South Korea, maybe for example, is very real. And this hostage situation is something that I don't think the Western world can afford. So ultimately, we don't really have much options in taking down North Korea, as bad and as like unfavorable as that seems lah. But there is still credit to be given in which if China does comply with Western standards, then we do have a greater degree of control over North Korea and how we can like continue to regulate North Korea in the long term. So I guess that answers your question regarding how Eastern Alliance would work and what would be like the most realistic outcomes of that.
Also, the thing is, like, if there is an incentive for China to now, okay, if China buys like the Western world's North Korea is unsustainable and you're going to have an influx of refugees and stuff, right? I think this is the closest grounds that the Western world can come with China in terms of fostering some form of diplomacy. Because if China can buy in that reason, then there's an incentive of both parties to work on maybe demilitarizing certain regions in North Korea because like China is opening up trade with them. North Korea demilitarized less because China's got their back or China doesn't have their back. I think whatever happens in the North Korean region, it requires constant communication between both parties. So I think this is
Yes.
it on the long term, because China feels less threatened, then it's easier to also demilitarize that entire region to reduce the fear and the paranoia that Kim Jong Un has, because he militarizes just because of the fear that the other countries might attack. And there you have it. These are a couple of suggestions we have on how to take down North Korea from the lens of the United States. And we've talked about why the United States is the best actor. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do give us a like. If you did not enjoy this podcast, please click the like button twice. We have used the video for reference. The link is in the descriptions. Please do follow all our socials. I think there's Facebook, Twitter, Insta, this YouTube channel. Yeah, I think that's it for now. And if you have any questions or any suggestions, feel free to put them in the comments down below. My name is Vishnu. With me is Muiz. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.